Let's have a look at a really great adjustment that's inside of Photoshop known as Shadow Highlight. Now you'll see in the process version 2012 in Camera Raw that there's a similar adjustment. And what this enables us to do is to open up details in the shadows and to recover details from the highlights. So if we look at the histogram here, you'll notice that the image is it's pretty good. I mean, maybe this is pushed a little bit into the black. You see the black's clipped a little bit. The white really isn't. But if we were to go into levels, we could clean this up a little bit. So let's create a levels adjustment. And if we open up our levels adjustment here, we notice that if we go here, we're not really able, we can't push that slider any more to the left to bring out any more detail in the shadows. Now we could play around with the highlights maybe. We might want to brighten those up a little bit. But if we do that, we lose our detail here. What if we want to bring out more detail in the clouds? Well, we can't really do that, but we can play around with the midtones. Notice if we do that, that brings it back, but we lose a lot. Or we can brighten it up. So we can just set our midtone value here in levels maybe, give it a little bit more, just a little bit more strength in the midtones. But we're not able to do a lot here with our shadows and our highlights. So what we're going to do is we're going to go under, there's no adjustment layer here. If you look under the adjustment layer here, you can look for shadow highlight and you're not going to find it. And that's because it doesn't exist as an adjustment layer. Now, if you want to apply it as adjustment layer, what we need to do is right click and then we'll convert this to a smart object. Now that it's a smart object, we can go under filter and then notice that all these filters can be applied, but not just that, but check this out. Under image adjustments, notice that most of these are grayed out except for shadow highlight and HDR toning. So these can be applied. So let's click on shadow highlight. This can be applied now as an adjustment layer. And we'll choose the show more options and we'll turn the preview off. So this is before. So if we turn on the shadows here, now notice what we're doing. Obviously you can see what's happening. Turn the preview on. Watch the shadow areas. As we pull this up, it opens up the shadows. Shows more detail in the shadows. Now the tonal width, this decides what areas are known as shadows and what aren't. So if we push it all the way to the left, notice now only the very, very darkest shadows around here are starting to open up. If we pull it all the way across, it's going to start to affect the midtones as well. So now you can see that this is not just affecting the shadows, but the midtones. Let's move it over a little bit. Pop open our histogram so you can see. And let's pull the tonal width down. And we'll redo that. So you can see right now, here's our shadows here. And we can pull our amount up and notice it pulls the amount in just in the shadows. That little mountain. But if we increase this, notice it widens that area that's being affected now. So now it's starting to affect all the way across there. So what you want to do is just tune in on the area that you want to brighten up and not anymore. And now the radius just kind of affects the way it looks. So we can just play around with it. It's almost like tone mapping if you're working in HDR, and that's another topic. But you can just play around with the radius until it's looking the way you like it. Now we have another option now. We can work in the highlights. So let's pull this over here. And I think you get the idea of what's going to happen in the histogram. It's going to be the same thing in the highlights. So if we go here, we can start to recover all this detail here in the highlights. Now the tonal width means that it starts to go into the midtones, or all the way across is only the very brightest whites. In this case, I want to get into the midtones as well. Start to recover a lot more. And we're just going to play around with this till we get it just the way we want. And now it looks a little bit strange, so we can play with the radius. And notice as we change the radius, see how it tone maps? Or just changes the way it looks. So you just play around with that until you get a look you like. Look up in the sky here. And see it just like there. I don't like it there. Very, very bad. And about there, it's starting to look pretty good. And look at it in the water. So you can see how it's affecting these in different ways. Now that we've done that, there's two other adjustments here, because what's happened now that we've opened up the detail in the shadows and in the highlights, sometimes it can cause the color to be a little too much. So we can play around with the color correction here. And what that does really is if you push it up, it just saturates. Pull it to the left, it desaturates. So sometimes I like to desaturate it just a little bit because it just kind of pushes it a little too far and it starts to look a little too artificial in some of these areas. And then finally, the mid-tone contrast. Now that we've got this detail showing in the highlights and the shadows, just the mid-tones need a little bit more crunch. So we can play around with that. We can pull it in a little bit more. And I kind of like it there. That's giving it a little bit more in the rocks and in the sky here. And you'll see that mid-tone contrast. And this works very, very similar to the in the Camera Raw. If you work in Camera Raw and you're working in Lightroom, you're going to have your clarity slider. Well, this works very, very similar to your clarity slider. And if you pull it too far, then you're going to want to pull your color back again. And in this case, I think it's just too far altogether. So if we look at it there, we've got a pretty good look. Now, there's just one problem here. I noticed that as we've done this now, it feels good, but I just feel like it needs a little more foundation in the blacks, because otherwise it just looks artificial again. So what we can do is we can do the black clip, and we can pull this up. And notice this, as we're doing that, it sets certain areas to black, and it pushes those and clips them. What it's doing is it's just pushing the left-hand side of the histogram across to create a solid black. And then we can do the same thing with the white clip. If we want to force a little bit here to white, because some of these light areas can turn gray, and we want them to be a pure white. So we can do that by doing the clip. So you can just click and drag to do this, and you can see as we do it, it takes a while sometimes. You see these clouds are starting to click. If you hold down the Shift key, you can actually move it much faster increments. And you can see it's very, very radical there. So what we want to do is just push it just a little bit, maybe back a little bit. So we're just getting these to white, but we don't want to lose that detail in the cloud. In fact, in this image, I probably don't want to clip the whites at all. And so we can do the Shift to black clip. And if you want to push it right up and give it heavy blacks, notice I'm pushing it very, very heavy. You can also do that. So let's find a nice spot there, and I think there's too much shadow detail coming out. Let's pull that down, and then once again we can play around with our mid-tone contrast, set that, and then play around with our color correction. You want a lot of color or you want a little color? Maybe put it about there, and you can see how much detail we've brought out of this image. Here's the photograph now, and if you look at it before, let's turn that off. There's a photograph before, and now there's the photograph after using shadow highlights. You can see this is a very, very powerful tool. Now let's click OK. And because we have converted this to a smart object, at any time we can double click now, actually down here, and then we can bring the settings back up and we can change them, because now it's working as a smart filter. Now, had we not converted to a smart object, it would just be an adjustment directly on top. So we can turn it off, and we can look at it before and after. So this is just a really useful tool. Obviously, we're using it in a landscape here, but this also works really well for backlit photographs where you have a person, with a very bright background, and the foreground is very dark. And in fact, we're going to have a look at that in the next tutorial. We're going to look at a second shadow highlight adjustment.